Yeah, I mean, there's two things that I think about on how we might go about preaching towards or allowing our preaching to be welcoming or significant maybe to these generations. One is Robert Wuthnow in his more recent book called Religion After the Baby Boom talks about how, at least in the American consciousness and the way that religion has functioned within our country, that religion is a conventional category. That it's something you do when you enter into conventional ways of life. So when you have children, when you have a career, when you have a mortgage, then you go and find a church. And the issue really with our context, of course, is that it's becoming harder and harder, or it's taking longer and longer to enter into those conventional ways of life. So people are graduating from college, and maybe 2, 3, 4 decades ago, you got a job, you maybe were married even before you graduated, you had kids right out of college or even in college, so of course you'd go right back to church. But now you may be 35, or you may be 25, still living in your parents' basement, still bouncing around jobs, still waiting for a chance to get that really great job that you had your major in, even though very few of us ever work in our major. So I think one of the issues is that our preaching has to be in some ways non-conventional. And that doesn't mean, like you have to take your shirt off and spin it over your head, non-conventional. But non-conventional in the sense that it speaks to something beyond just kind of being this middle America or this kind of conventional way of living. But is there something profound about the Christian message? Is it fundamentally non-conventional? Is there something about utter absurdity in this message? That we're calling people not to enter into a conventional way of life, but to love enemy and to be weak and to confess the absurd paradox of God being divine and human. I mean, that God shows God's self and reveals God's self fully in a crucified peasant from the worst, from this God-forsaken place that nothing good would come out of. I mean, I think our preaching can touch a younger generation who's living more in non-conventional ways, or is knowing that they're going to go to college, graduate from college, and then be living in between by our preaching taking that form. The second thing that I think is significant, and maybe even a little bit more direct, is that Erik Erikson, who's this kind of developmental theorist, this classic developmental theorist, in many ways his theories have been shown to be not necessarily work as much in our time, that culture is just a little bit more complicated, that there are things he didn't see in the 1930s and 40s that are happening now. One of the things that he said that still I find helpful and I think right is he said that people in this adolescent stage of life and people in what he called this last stage of life tend to ask existential questions. That they're just in the life cycle, they're up against existential questions. But what he said, which is really interesting, is that people in this generative stage of life, people, as you had mentioned, who are between 26 and maybe 56 or something, they tend not to ask as many existential questions. And for Erikson and kind of his whole kind of system, it's because they're building things. I mean, they have mortgages and they have careers and they're trying to climb ladders, so they tend not, and they're raising children, so they tend not to have the time or the energy, or just the way their life unfolds doesn't lead them to ask existential questions. Which, and in some ways that isn't true anymore, because people lose jobs, people's marriages end. There's these major transitions that now happen that in Erikson's day didn't necessarily happen, that lead people into existential questions. But I wonder if our preaching would be more inclusive of people at the end of life, people who are kind of able abstractly even to hear and engage in preaching, and even people who find themselves in radical transitions in the middle of that generative stage, if such a thing even exists anymore, by, again, our preaching having something at stake that asks existential questions like, what is a lifetime and why do we live it? And where does God encounter us in the midst of these big questions? And I think part of it is making the pulpit a place where perplexity, where doubt is spoken and shared in the community, and where we really face darkness together, where we really stare down darkness in the thickness of life. And I think we find that on all those stages. And I think part of the reason younger populations of people don't hear much in preaching is because they don't hear anything that's at stake, and there's no one who seems to want to, in this moment, bear reality.